Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly history discussion. Thanks for joining me as always. Try to do this on time every week at 3 o'clock on Tuesdays. I know a lot of people watch later. That's cool too. I just get distracted with some of the work I'm doing, and sometimes I'm a little late. But anyway, this week's topic comes from some questions I've been getting since, as my job as town historian, we put in a new exhibit for the 150th anniversary of the Village of East Aurora, which is occurring this year, 2024. The village was actually incorporated in 1874. It's actually reincorporated, but we'll talk about that in a bit. And those questions have come up again. I've talked about this before. I've written about this before in various different articles. And actually, if you search through the videos that we do, I think more than a year ago, I discussed the difference between towns, villages, and hamlets. But the question came up a couple of times, and I saw on some of the social media, some of the comments that were being made about different celebrations of anniversaries and the differences between the town and the village. So, and sometimes I get myself confused. So I thought it would be a good topic to talk about today in celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Village of East Aurora becoming the Village of East Aurora. So, so what is the difference between Aurora, which is what I hear this question quite a bit, the difference between Aurora and East Aurora? And in high school, I had one of substitute teachers, and I don't know why I remember this, but she had said, "Well, is there really a difference?" And I was like, "Of course, there's a difference." Even in high school, I was into this history and geographic boundaries and things like that, studying these things. Yeah, I was a weird high schooler who enjoyed history. But so I was like, yeah, there is definitely a difference between Aurora and East Aurora. And then now we get the question of, well, what if there's an East Aurora, where in the heck did West Aurora go? And why is there an East Aurora without a West Aurora? And there's a very complicated but very interesting history to all of this. And so I think the easiest way to explain it, and someone actually asked me when I was we had just come across each other, and they asked, "Oh, I had, what's the difference between this and the East Aurora and Aurora?" And they wanted me to explain it in about a minute, and it's kind of impossible to do. So I'll do the best I can, and try to do it in chronological order, because I think that's what I haven't done before, and it really is in my brain how I can sort of wrap my head around it. So we're going to go all the way back to 1818, and actually that was the year the town of Aurora came into existence. We had been part of the town of Willink, which was much bigger in 1805, early 1800s, had gotten smaller to the point of what it is today. It took up the area of what is today Aurora, Wales, Holland, and Colden. Then in 1818, as more settlers were coming to our area, the towns were getting smaller. It took a lot more time to get to town meetings. If the geographic area was huge, we actually had to go up to what is now Newstead today to vote, to do any town business. So as more settlers came, the towns got smaller. So in 1818, the town of Willink, which was named after a principal of the Holland Land Company. He never set foot. One of my pet peeves is we named all these things after him, and he never set foot here on the land that we named after him. Nor do we think he even came to the United States, set foot in the United States. But we named things after him. Wilhelm Willink, and he was a principal of the Holland Land Company. So the town of Willink was divided into three towns at that point. Colden split off from Holland later, and Aurora. They named it Aurora. My theory is a lot of places were named Aurora because of the definition of one of the definitions of Aurora was very optimistic, the dawn, a dawn of a new town, very optimistic for the future of this new town. This is only the beginning. It was a very optimistic name. And some of the people who settled here had been living before they came here in the Finger Lakes region, which had the village of Aurora. So I think they may have been inspired by that name. We're not quite sure. But in any event, 1818, the state legislature created this town, and we named it Aurora. And so it's a 6 mile by 6 mile township that in the early days, the towns were really just geographic survey lines. And so essentially a square. They're not all perfect, but the towns are at this point based off of squares geographically, not where people settled necessarily. Just they took a survey line and made a straight line, and that's where the town lines were. So that was 1818, town of Aurora. Well, in New York State, in a few years later, the New York State created a system where we could incorporate villages. So if you had an area that had a larger population, for instance, where East Aurora is today, pockets of populated areas, you could incorporate as a corporation. You'd have a board of trustees and a president. There was a president before there were mayors. They changed the title in the mid 20th century to provide services that the whole town might not want. For instance, sidewalks, later on paved streets, water service, sewer service, a host of things that businesses would want, where your more populated areas would want a particular service. Back in the 1800s, there would be the watering of the streets because they were all dirt streets, and they would water the streets, plank roads, things like that. A whole host of police services, even in the 1800s, where folks out in the more rural areas wouldn't want to pay for it because they weren't necessarily getting the benefit of it. But the more concentrated, populated area would want those services. So the New York State created a system where you could incorporate as a village, create your own government, essentially a glorified homeowners association without all the problems that we see that HOAs have. But anyway, where you provide a specific set of services that the more rural areas wouldn't want. So in 1836, residents at what is now the east end of the Village of East Aurora, so that would be where Vidler's and the Aurora Theater are, they voted in 1836 to incorporate as the Village of Auroraville. Auroraville within the town of Aurora. So as a village, you get enhanced services. You pay additional taxes for those enhanced services. Or the village provides services and the town doesn't in that concentrated populated area. So they voted to do that and incorporate as the Village of Aurora in 1836. I discovered Auroraville, interestingly, through an advertisement I saw back in what was our first newspaper, the Aurora Standard, which published in the 1830s. For about 4 years in the 1830s, we had a newspaper. It was our first newspaper. And I discovered a little advertisement in there that said Auroraville. And I said, what's this Auroraville? I had always heard rumors about it. It turns out we incorporated that end of town, incorporated as the Village of Auroraville. I checked the state archives and the state legislature proceedings from 1836, and sure enough, I found that the boundaries delineated of the Village of Auroraville. It took me a while to figure out what those boundaries meant, but essentially we think that it was from about Center Street east, including Olean Road and essentially what is today the Village of East Aurora, but from Center Street east. I'm still looking into, and I made it a goal this year as we celebrate the anniversary of the Village of East Aurora, to find out when Auroraville went out of existence. I can't find where they voted to dissolve. It may have been a case where they didn't necessarily officially resolve, that they just stopped holding meetings and elections and the village just kind of went away. But in any event, it only lasted a few years regardless of how it dissolved. And I don't see the Village of Auroraville mentioned after a couple years in the 1830s. But there was an ad for the Globe Hotel that listed Globe Hotel Auroraville in it. So stay tuned for more information about that because I'm going to do a little more research on that. So that's Auroraville incorporated within the town of Aurora. So actually, when you are a resident, this is a question I get a lot too, and a lot of people who work in the town and village government get. If you are a resident of a village, you are still a resident of the town you are in. You're just incorporated within a special district, essentially, within the town to provide enhanced services. Over the years, some of those services have blended a little bit. A lot of people in the town get water service, get some of the services that were really exclusive to villages back in the day. But it is on the purpose of a village is to provide enhanced services that otherwise wouldn't be provided to other areas of the town. Villages can be in both a town in two towns at the same two towns. They can overlap the boundaries, and in some places they overlap county lines too. So they don't have to all be within one town. So villages are different than towns, but they're within the towns. So the village of Auroraville dissolves in 1849. The folks at the other end of the populated area of our community, at the west end where the circle is today, the Bar Bill and all the businesses down there, they voted to incorporate as the village of Willink. That name comes up again. Mind you, the town of Willink had gone out of existence, but they liked this name so much, the village of Willink, and the post office was still named Willink too. That was one thing. It might be the reason why they kept the name, is the post office that served our community was known as Willink, and the Postal Service did not change it after the town of Willink went out of existence. So in 1849, they incorporate at the west end. We believe that that line went as far east as they say around Park Place, but it actually, when I looked at some of the surveys, and I'm a stickler for detail, if you haven't noticed, the eastern boundary of Hamlin Park is kind of where that eastern boundary of the village of Willink existed. So from the west end to there. So they incorporated in 1849. In 1850, the Postal Service, after a long debate and a lot of begging on behalf of people who lived here and business people, is we only had one post office, and at the time it was at the west end, the Willink post office. The Postal Service agreed to split the post office here and create two. So in 1850, they decided to make two post offices, and they named the one at the west end West Aurora, because it was on the western end of this little community we had. And then on the eastern end, they named that East Aurora. Well, on paper, that looks great. You have the town of Aurora, 6 miles by 6 miles, and then within that, you have a small community that has two post offices, and within that, you have East Aurora and West Aurora. That looks great. Very clean, looks, very nice. The only problem is the West Aurora post office served the village of Willink within the town of Aurora. So it got really complicated. So after only a few years, with all this complication, you would be mailing mail to someone who lived within the village of Willink, but it would go to the West Aurora post office. Postal Service agreed. They changed it back to Willink. So we lost West Aurora, but East Aurora stayed. So you had the Willink post office at the west end and the East Aurora post office on the east end, and no West Aurora anymore. All within the town of Aurora. Okay? So then, in 1874, and this is the anniversary we're celebrating this year, the 150th anniversary, in January of 1874, there had been a movement for a while to merge the two communities together. We had a pocket of population at the eastern end of what is today East Aurora, and a pocket of population at the western end. And it was growing together. The school was built in the middle of it all. The Roycroft hadn't come along yet, but they certainly, when Albert Hubbard came to town, knew where to locate, in between those two populated areas. The railroad had come through the eastern end in the 1860s. So the two little hamlets, the village, actually the incorporated village of Willink that had its own government, and the hamlet, which is an unincorporated populated area, they were growing together. So there was a movement to combine those two areas under one village government, that the eastern end, formerly Auroraville, and the village of Willink needed those enhanced services. So they voted in January of 1874 to extend the boundaries of Willink to include the eastern end, what is essentially today the village of East Aurora. Then state and county officials allowed the residents of that new expanded village to vote on the name, whether to keep the Willink name. So between my predecessor as historian, and a lot of local historians argue that between January of 1874 and June of 1874, that the extended village was still named Willink. So what is essentially today East Aurora was known as Willink for a few months after it was extended. Um, so on June 2nd, actually, of 1874, the residents, the men, women weren't allowed to vote yet, they voted whether or not to keep East Aurora or keep a Willink as the name or take on the East Aurora name as the village. So 122 people voted in favor of East Aurora, 103 voted for the name Willink, and that, if you do the math, is a 19 vote difference. So every vote does count. So with that, the Village of East Aurora was born, even though the name East Aurora had been in existence since the post office started in 1850. The Village of East Aurora was born on June 2nd of 1874, and that's really kind of the date we use. Even though the village was extended, the name Village of East Aurora came into existence with that vote on June 2nd of 1874. Had the residents chosen Willink, I don't think we would have reincorporated under a new name, and actually this anniversary would probably have less significance because the village of Willink was in existence since 1849, and that's really the date that the village started. But because we picked a new name, the Village of East Aurora as a name came into existence in June of 1874, and that's the anniversary we celebrate. So that's the difference between Aurora and East Aurora, and why we don't have West Aurora. So the Village of East Aurora, through all that complicated history, became the Village of East Aurora in 1874, and it's the village within the town of Aurora. To complicate things even more, we still had the Willink post office at the west end in the Village of East Aurora, the new expanded Village of East Aurora, and the East Aurora post office at the east end. So we had two post offices within the Village of East Aurora that served a much bigger area than the village. So you could get mail. You could be on the west end of the Village of East Aurora, so the exact opposite problem that happened with Willink earlier was happening with people in the Village of East Aurora, is you lived in the Village of East Aurora, but you got your mail in Willink. So about half the population of the new Village of East Aurora was still getting their mail in Willink. Well, after World War I, they decided, because of course it took a while, but the communities had grown together, so we were all under one village government, and the Postal Service decided to close the Willink post office at the west end and merge it with the East Aurora post office. So it became East Aurora post office within the Village of East Aurora after World War I. What complicates things even today, though, is people who get their mail in East Aurora, so you have 14052 zip code and you get your mail delivered to East Aurora, not all of those folks, not all of you who get your mail at the East Aurora post office live in the Village of East Aurora. The Village of East Aurora is a village government with those enhanced services. The post office with the same name has totally different geographic boundaries. So people get confused a lot, myself included, when we look at maps or try to figure out where properties are. And when people go to call their government or pay their taxes, they don't necessarily know where they live. And it's a common problem, so it's understood. But you could get your mail in East Aurora, but you don't live in the Village of East Aurora. You may live in the town of Aurora. And some people who get their mail in East Aurora don't even live in the town of Aurora. They live in Wales, and I think it extends into Elma. So the postal district is different than the village. So when you say you live in East Aurora, it means different things depending on what you're talking about. You could live in East Aurora because you get your mail there, but you don't live in the Village of East Aurora. You may live in the town of Aurora. So the term East Aurora means different things depending on what you're talking about. So the Aurora is the town, the 6 mile by 6 mile piece of land that has a town board that goes back to 1818. The village is an incorporated government within that town, and then that provides enhanced services known as East Aurora, and we talked about why there's no West Aurora and how it got its name East Aurora. And we couldn't name it Aurora. So, like, you look at Orchard Park, they have the Village of Orchard Park within the town of Orchard Park. Well, we couldn't do that because when we applied to be a village and voted, the Village of Aurora had already existed in the Finger Lakes region, which we talked about before. So we can be the town of Aurora because there's no other town named Aurora. But we can't be the Village of Aurora because there's already a Village of Aurora in the Finger Lakes region. And we get phone calls for them all the time asking for historic information, and the clerk's office gets calls, misdirected calls, because there are two Aurora, New Yorks. One's a town, one's a village. So we had to be Auroraville originally, and then the third village that's in our history became East Aurora because we couldn't become Aurora. I think it would be easier if we could just be the Village of Aurora within the town of Aurora, but because there's one that already exists, we couldn't do that. So hopefully that's not too complicated. I am working on a couple articles in celebration, commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Village of East Aurora, or the village becoming East Aurora, for this year, to help explain it a little more and do a little more research into that I call it pesky Village of Auroraville, which I don't know too much about, and I want to know more about because it only lasted a couple years. So please ask questions, send your comments. Thank you for the support of this video project. Again, I am Rob Goller, the town and village historian, but these projects, a lot of my research and the video projects that I do are not officially connected to my job as historian. And if you have any comments or ideas, these ideas come from you. I really like the back and forth and the commentary about it. Please leave either a comment or send me a private message. Also, these videos are, as always, are available on the YouTube channel if you prefer to watch that way, Robert Lowell Goller. And if you like what you see, please share, please comment, please like the page if you haven't done so already. I really appreciate all the support of this. And I think next week we're going to talk about, not next week, the week after that. I promise. I've gotten a lot of people asking about the weather, a couple aspects about the weather. We'll get back to that in a couple weeks. Next week I have another idea about the history of February break. So we'll talk about that next week. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.